So you're a multidisciplinary artist ranging video, sound, poetry, music, theatre, performance with a background in sculpture and illustration, installation. And I take it you were pretty creative growing up then, is that fair to say?
Yeah, that probably is fair to say. I mean, I was quite like drawing based, making based, and then I used to do a lot of like choir, all of the creative things, pretty much, dance, everything. But I was always so good at maths, which people would assume that I wasn't. So it was a big shock when I passed that for my GCSEs.
Christ, I didn't even pass. I still don't have a maths GCSE, let me tell you. Well, a D counts as a GCSE, but it's still pretty low on the spectrum, let me tell you. So, as multi-talented, obviously, as you are, with your finger in all these pies, etc., how are you zoning in on the right medium to execute an idea?
A lot of the time, it will just kind of be through if I'm developing a story. So one of my recent video projects was a lot of dolls chairs that ended up having a conversation, and I ended up making a video animation. But a lot of that came from, I started with audio and just like kind of messing around with some of my friends, and then I animated from that. So it would kind of be the taking what I have and then realizing, okay, if you've got an audio, I'm most likely gonna end up making a video. They almost like complement each other, as opposed to, if I take an audio, I'm less likely to make like a three-dimensional object. So a lot of the time it would just be the kind of what the topic is about. So if it's about like if it's a very musical kind of theme about like art art school and taking the mic, then I'll go more for performance. Whereas if it's something like material really draws me in, then I'll end up kind of going more to the installation kind of route.
I guess with you sort of being as multidisciplinary as you are with your craft, I suppose you have the luxury in some ways to sort of delve down that path and go down that path. And I mean, I don't know. I just want to ask how it is that your mind works in that manner, how you do land upon an idea. But I suppose, as I also kind of said and answered my own question, it kind of depends on what it is, and it can also just kind of be anything at the same time, right?
Well, a lot of it starts by like I have like a book where a lot of the time I just have a really quick idea, and then like I'll just jot down absolutely everything that I possibly think of. I kind of have a bit like ADHD brain, which would just be like, oh look, oh that's a really good pun that says, yeah, make sure you park it under here. And I said, oh, I should make a big sculpture that says it, and it looks like a text, and I could install it there. And so I'll write it down, and then I'll have to go back to stuff. And so just not discarding any ideas, and I just kind of interact with the world, and then realize what media will best fit the idea.
Sure. So I take it you do a lot of journaling then, because I know for myself anyway, and I think a lot of others too. I mean, I keep a lot of random flipping, sketchbooks, notepads, notes on the phone at 3 a.m. in the morning. You know what I mean? Just jotting ideas that are nonsensical. I take it you are also one of those.
Oh yeah, I've got a multitude of books, and none of which have any kind of logic when somebody else was to read them. I do also do this thing where, like, every morning when I wake up for half an hour, I'll just write whatever comes to my head for half an hour just to get a page down. And so it's like if you start the day with doing some writing, then it's almost like you can't have a day where you feel like, oh, I can't write, because you know that you've already done something.
Right, so that's sort of a mental and creative exercise then. So what is the purpose of that for you then? Is that just to sort of get the juices going and to say that you've done some writing that day, or is there something more to it for you?
For me, it's like having a bit of a routine, isn't it? It's like feeling like you've had an output of some kind. I think that actually a lot of, it's like honing in on creativity to try and make it sustainable for me is to try and make sure that I'm living living in a routine that makes sense, because I have a tendency when I get obsessed with an idea to just be like obsessed with it for like days, not sleeping, like this is what's going to happen. And then it's like it's like a sugar high almost, and then it's just you're gonna crash at some point. Whereas if you set kind of like deadlines for yourself and things you're going to do, then sometimes it can be easier to manage as well.
No, I think I agree, and I think that sort of segues nicely into this like non-sustainable way of living with the sort of with sort of just being an artist. An unsustainability of staying up all night, not really eating because you've just powered through 4 hours of bossing a bloody painting because you're so in the moment, which is that sort of sugar high, creative high that you kind of talk about. And I know that before this, you mentioned previously, like at art school, that your experience was fairly marred to an extent by a lack of effort to sort of promote student mental health and well-being, resulting in part to these protests at the Glasgow School of Art where you studied. What do you think could be done to better promote this sort of positive change within schools?
I think that it's got to be kind of across the university. Like, you can't have one tutor saying to a student, "Oh yeah, just work through the night to meet the deadline tomorrow," and also be expecting students to be able to have like a healthy relationship between like work-life balance. I think that it's got to be kind of across the board. You also can't have people almost being dismissive that mental health is a huge issue in art schools, especially at the moment when you have the students like at the Glasgow School of Art. They're not getting any studio access, and they're getting some studio access, but not having a studio space and being able to go in, have that human interaction. The ripple effects of that onto the student psyche is massive. And so I would say that universities need to have better communication with the students, listen to the students, because students are very willing to talk about these issues. I mean, today there were protests and many staff were invited and very few turned up, of specifically named staff members at the higher end of the institution. And I think that, yeah, I had cases, for example, with like issues with fees trying to get sorted out, when it would take a year to get it sorted out in a very small institution. And I had a thing, about having anxiety issues that says, this student needs that extra support. But it's like, if I have somebody with very aggressive emails chasing me for something which isn't my fault to do with student finance, it's not very, it needs a more kind of people-based approach, really. It's like universities aren't really treating students like people.
Sure, yeah. I mean, it kind of sounds like that in some ways. Customers. It sounds like a retail sort of thing where you get that that shop assistant who just doesn't really want to be there, sort of thing, and so that kind of echoes out on their personality.
I was looking at the moment, doing like a arts kind of management based degree, and I was looking at kind of different stakeholders, and you have kind of this idea of like a stakeholder who has a really high interest but really little power, and that's actually almost what students have, because a lot of the students, they're not the fee payers. They are the people who are taking out a loan, and the fee payers are sometimes, the government, or you have the other parents and things like that. So, and almost like they've got high power but low interest, and so it's a difficult situation for students, I think, at the moment.
But with that in mind, especially with the mental health angle and experiencing all this at university, etc., you yourself experienced trichotillomania since you were about 10 years old, was it? In which stress, anxiety, shame, they all overlap, interact, and sort of exacerbate that further. Could you talk us through some of perhaps your earliest memories of that, and perhaps what it is for those who don't know? Because I think I'm probably not alone in some ways. Knowing and understanding what it is.
Sure. So trichotillomania is it comes under the big branch of BFRB disorders, which are body-focused repetitive behaviors. So that will include things like nail biting or hair pulling or skin picking. So it would affects about 1 in 20 people, BFRBs, about 5% of the population. And so trichotillomania is like hair pulling. I think my earliest memories of it, I think, were very high stress high stress environments, and then I actually kind of was lucky that my parents picked up on it, and I was taken to CAMS, which is the Child Mental Health Services, for it. At quite a young age, but actually there's a really big online community for it, and for me, a lot of it is to do with sometimes realizing that it's not just going to go away. It's kind of one of those things that just stays with you for life. You know, lots of people obviously want to like aspire for, I'll never pull out my hair ever again. But some people realize that, oh, you know, that maybe this is something that I'm just going to have to live with and will come in waves.
You've mentioned that it sort of alters the way in which you view art as a creative, right? Can you talk us through that relationship and what is it about art and the Trichotillomania that coalesce, can sort of interact and affect each other that sort of, well, changes how you view art, I suppose?
I think for me, it's almost like if I watch a video piece, because Trichotillomania makes me so like aware of, you know, like my hair, myself, how I look, is that for me, like if I see a person with eyelashes, I'm like, well, that's not a given. It's not a given that they're going to have eyelashes. It's almost like the having eyelashes themselves is loaded to me as like, oh, this person doesn't pull out their eyelashes,
Sure.
you know, or
Right.
in the same way, like if somebody is filming me in a video and I have no eyelashes at the time, I think, oh well, if somebody notices that I don't have eyelashes, then it's not that it's almost impossible for me to become that character, because I'm carrying like a weight of something that is almost from my own life to myself into that video piece, for example. But also I find that Trichotillomania it's a very tactile thing, and I'm a very tactile person. I like sculpture, I like making things, I like doing stuff with my hands, and so there is that kind of link there. Like if I was knitting, for example, like I wouldn't be pulling, like, you know, it's got a similar kind of flow with it, with the relationship with your needing to like feel something.
In some ways then, the Trichotillomania and the creativity kind of work pretty well together for you, in that what you're essentially saying is that it's almost a great distraction in some ways, that it keeps your hands busy. Is that sort of what you were kind of touching on?
And also I think that it's almost like if I wasn't the kind of person who had trick, I also probably wouldn't be the kind of person who was creative, because it's the same kind of desire for movement and doing something, and, you know, like that physical sensation, that outlet in some way. So for me, there's a quite direct relationship. Also, sometimes people have wider, varying things. So for me, like I have anxiety as well as trichotillomania. It's not always going to be like on its own, or it might be a kind of. Some people might pull out their hair as a result of something else. You know, it doesn't necessarily have to just be the BFRB.
Sure, no, of course. I mean, I feel like with a lot of sort of mental health disorders or issues, they really do overlap, and I can imagine that obviously with the anxiety that you mentioned, that would naturally coalesce with the trick, as we were calling it. I mean, how are you, aside from the art being a sort of therapy in some ways and keeping you busy and distracted in terms of your hands, how else are you sort of monitoring and self-caring?
So for me, having really high screen time is a issue like that. That's a trigger for me. So if I'm, you know, going to be staring at a screen, making sure that I am, you know, writing an essay, it's exam season coming up as well, that I am trying to, for the trick, I'll try and basically make sure that I'm writing my daily plan in advance, so that I'm not getting stressed out and I know what I'm supposed to be doing at certain times, and I'll put in time for that. So I'll say, okay, I'm not going to go more than 2 hours on this computer without taking a break. Or for writing essays or doing any kind of research, I'll definitely do most of it by hand, at least at the start, to try and avoid, you know, a lot of high stress on the computer, type. I would also say, for me, like a really useful thing, I'm one of the kind of people that I love talking, and I find that if I you know, have a lot of good friends around me who kind of know about it, that is a kind of relief of a stress factor for me. So like when I was first at going into studios at GSA, I remember just saying, you know, I mentioned it to a couple people, I do this thing just so that I'm not thinking, oh, if I go into the university and I'm missing an eyebrow, everyone's gonna think, oh, what the hell's happened here? It's like, if you almost, when you're not having the worst time, it's almost to put those steps in place before you are having the worst time.